settle in for a moment, as if the dust in the room had paused mid-air. This won't be about heroes or banners, wood, rope, tension, and the brief arc that carried fear farther than strength ever could. Long before the great siege engines carved their verdicts into stone, smaller constructions shaped the anxieties of skirmishes and marches, and among them, the short ballista stood like an austere compromise between discipline and improvisation, fashioned to be carried rather than assembled, to speak sharply rather than loudly. It delivered its purpose through compact limbs of taut sinew and polished wood, translating torsion into a line so straight it felt less thrown than released from some hidden intention inside the machine itself. Carried across uneven ground by soldiers who understood the value of a weapon that required neither elevation nor ceremony, it became a companion to uncertainty. When a patrol vanished behind a ridge or when a narrow valley tightened around marching feet, this small frame was planted in the soil like a question the enemy was not prepared to answer. Its bolts struck not through power but through inevitability, finding gaps in advancing formations, pinning riders mid-gallop, silencing officers who stood too confidently at the front. The machine's value was not in its size but in the way it imposed stillness around it. Crews learned to recognize the hush that fell just before the trigger snapped, a silence so thin it felt like the air itself was bracing. From such moments emerged the logic that smaller engines could change the rhythm of encounters, not by destroying walls, but by unsettling the people who believed those walls would suffice. That logic narrowed further in the invention of the hand-driven engines that followed, as if warfare were folding itself inward, seeking tools that did not require teams or carpenters, but only focus, nerve, and the will to shape a moment before it swallowed the combatant whole. And so the first thought after the short ballista naturally became the hand catapult, a compact torsion arm held as tightly as a shield, its wooden frame absorbing the tremor of coiled rope straining against its own limits. It didn't hurl boulders or command ranges. It cast stones, shards, clay fragments, whatever weight one soldier could carry, yet still trust to land with meaning. Where the ballista demanded clear lines, the hand catapult thrived in obstruction. Courtyards muddled with debris, forest paths where light fell in broken patterns, alleys where walls pressed closer than breath. Its arc was brief, heavy, almost abrupt. But in that compression lay its truth. Force delivered without distance, impact delivered before surprise had time to dilute itself. Infantry used it not as an engine but as an equalizer, a way to impose reach where none existed, to break a shield raised too early, or disrupt a charge that needed one more heartbeat to become lethal. It taught armies that size alone no longer determined menace. Tension, leverage, and timing were enough to redefine danger. And from that understanding emerged the next forgotten construction, stranger still, shaped for a problem no larger machine could solve, waiting in the shadows of the story that follows. From the cramped precision of the hand catapult, warfare drifted naturally towards something even more peculiar, a device that seemed almost improvisational in purpose, yet deliberate in its construction, built for moments when visibility narrowed and hesitation became fatal. The stone thrower for arrows emerged from this need, a compact frame engineered not to launch rocks, but to send heavy arrows in a flat, brutal arc across distances too short for bows, yet too chaotic for disciplined volleys. It was a contradiction made functional, a machine designed to imitate a single archer's certainty while exceeding the force any archer could generate at such proximity. Its arm snapped forward with an abruptness that felt less like a throw and more like a refusal to let the projectile remain in human hands. In the dense clutter of palisade entrances, in ravines where ambushers crouched below fallen branches, in the tight turns of siege corridors, where attackers funneled into narrow channels, this strange hybrid altered the geometry of fear. Men advanced with shields higher, spears angled differently, knowing that somewhere ahead, a hidden operator tracked them through slits and shadows. And because it launched not arcs, but low, skimming lines, the weapon turned ground itself into an accomplice, sending arrows ricocheting off stone and timber, fracturing formations that believed they were protected by proximity. It did not dominate battles, but it disturbed them, and disturbance was often enough to shift momentum. That shift, small as it seemed, inspired yet another creation. A system built not for open engagements, but for stillness, patience, and the quiet cruelty of waiting. From the low flight of those skimming arrows, warfare descended further into shadows where visibility dissolved and sound mattered more than distance, shaping a tool meant not for the open ground, but for the moments when stillness became a trap. The dart-throwing system belonged to that hidden architecture of battle, an arrangement of levers, cords, and weighted arms designed to lie folded beneath leaves, behind brush, within narrow ravines, waiting for the quiet alignment of footsteps. It wasn't a single machine, but a principle. Tension stored in silence, released not by an operator's hand, but by the enemy's own movement. When triggered, it sent a fan of short, heavy darts forward in a brutal, low burst, less a spread of projectiles than a sudden reshaping of the air itself. These darts didn't need range. They needed inevitability, the kind created when a warrior's stride carried him into the narrow corridor of their flight. In ambushes, they collapsed momentum. In night raids, they broke confidence. On forested borders where patrols listened more than they saw, they carved caution into every step. What defined the system wasn't force but timing. The understanding that a dart released at precisely the wrong moment for the target became more decisive than a stone launched from any grand machine. And from that logic emerged an even more primitive yet strangely potent solution, one that belonged entirely to the human hand, stripped of frames and levers yet guided by centuries of refinement. Ready to hurl not stones or arrows, but something far more unsettling. From those hidden bursts of darts, warfare curved back toward the oldest gesture in human conflict, the rotation of a wrist and the tightening of a cord. Yet even that ancient motion evolved into something heavier, darker, shaped for moments when sound and fire carried as much meaning as impact. The bomb sling emerged from this instinct, a simple length of leather or woven fiber designed not for stones, but for small explosive vessels sealed with pitch, resin, or fragile clay. In the hands of trained skirmishers, it turned the sky into a brief, trembling arc of dread. For the projectile didn't need to strike with precision. It merely needed to land within breath's distance of its target for the world to fracture into flame, smoke, and shards. Unlike catapults, it required no crew, no setup, no calculations beyond the feel of weight in the palm and the moment the sling's pocket loosened. Yet despite this minimalism, it introduced a psychological gravity disproportionate to its size. Defenders, hearing the whistle overhead, didn't brace for impact, but for ignition, searching the ground for the spark that would decide whether a courtyard became an inferno. In night raids, it was a phantom. In sieges, it was an irritant that shook discipline. In open skirmishes, it disrupted the rhythm of charge and countercharge, forcing opponents to move not as lines, but as scattered shapes avoiding pools of fire. And from the simplicity of its logic, that a human arm could extend fear farther than any torch, engineers imagined another engine, one that leaned again into mechanics, but miniaturized, portable, and carrying the lineage of larger siege machines in a frame that could be assembled before a watchtower, even noticed the movement below. From the fire-marked arcs of the bomb sling, the path of invention returned to wood and rope, yet on a scale that seemed almost improbable, as if a fragment of siegecraft had been carved away and taught to live on its own. The short trebuchet emerged from this idea, a miniature reflection of the great counterweight engines that once reshaped horizons, but built small enough to follow an army rather than anchor it. Its frame could be raised by a handful of men, its counterweight filled with whatever lay nearest: stones, scrap, dense earth. And though its throws lacked the sweeping majesty of its larger kin, they carried a precision and rhythm suited for skirmishes, not sieges. In narrow passes, it could loft a clay pot into the blind turn ahead. On riverbanks, it could send weighted darts across the water where archers failed. In raids, it served as a silent companion, assembled quickly, fired briefly, vanished before dawn. Its arm rose and fell in a measured cadence, the sling unfurling not in grandeur but in intent, each shot tracing a compact arc that arrived too swiftly for defenders to read. And because it required no walls to justify its presence, it became a weapon of movement, an engine that traveled with the shifting borderlines of conflict, offering a taste of siege power to bands that lacked the resources for anything monumental. This blend of mobility and momentum planted a new thought in the minds of engineers. If a trebuchet could be condensed into a traveling frame, then perhaps other engines could shrink even further, tailored not to crack stone, but to command those fleeting moments when infantry needed reach without delay. Thus, the logic of thrown fire and portable leverage pressed naturally toward a device shaped for the hand, meant not to imitate bows or slings, but to give a single soldier the echo of a siege machine's authority. From the compact cadence of the short trebuchet, the progression toward portability reached a new threshold, where the might of larger engines was distilled into something so lean it could accompany the lightest ranks of infantry. The javelin thrower, a miniature catapult built to hurl spears rather than bolts or stones, embodied this narrowing of purpose. Its arm, shorter than that of any trebuchet, yet sturdier than the limbs of a bow, bent under the strain of coiled fibers until released in a violent forward sweep that propelled a javelin farther and harder than any human arm could dream to match. In open fields, it disrupted cavalry, striking mounts before their riders registered the threat. In dense undergrowth, it carved lanes of danger where shields were useless. On palisade lines, it sent spears arcing low enough to slip beneath raised defenses. Its shots did not rely on the elegance of flight, but on the authority of momentum, each spear leaving the frame with a heavy finality that made even seasoned soldiers hesitate. Crews learned to angle its base with a precision that felt more like instinct than calculation, for the machine thrived on marginal distances. That narrow band where a thrown spear would falter, but a launched one would strike true. And because it echoed the logic of siege engines in a form one man could oversee, it shifted expectations among light infantry, teaching them that their reach no longer ended at the tips of their own arms. From this shift grew another idea entirely, one that turned not to distance, but to destruction, to the knowledge that fire itself could be thrown with intention if given the right vessel and the right machine to cast it. From the heavy certainty of the launched javelin, the evolution of these engines curved once more toward flame, as if warfare kept returning to the elemental truth that fear burned faster than metal could fly. The fire sling emerged from this return, a tool that resembled its simpler ancestors, yet carried a far more deliberate intention. Its leather cradle was reinforced to hold vessels filled with resin, pitch, or oil, substances that clung to surfaces and refused to die once ignited. Soldiers swung it in widening circles until the air hummed with a rising heat, then released the projectile into an arc that trembled with both weight and purpose. It was not designed for range. It was designed for consequence, for the way burning liquid crawled across wood, seeped into cracks, and chased defenders from positions they believed secure. On palisades, its shots spread fire where buckets of water were useless. In confined courtyards, they turned solid ground into shifting, blistering terrain. In twilight ambushes, the sudden bloom of flame broke formations more effectively than any spear. Operators learned to read wind and distance not for precision, but for direction. For the path of fire mattered more than the point of impact. And because a single burning vessel could unravel discipline faster than a rain of arrows, the fire sling became a quiet companion to raids, a weapon that didn't need to kill to dominate. From this sharpened understanding of how flame traveled, engineers and soldiers alike began to imagine devices that didn't rely on the human arm at all, machines built to store threat until the world itself triggered it. Engines whose violence waited patiently beneath branches, under snow, beside narrow paths, unseen until their impact was already guaranteed. From the crawling arcs of fire, the logic of anticipation deepened, turning away from human swing toward mechanisms that waited, patient and unobserved, until circumstance completed their motion. The core trap, a device built to hurl small iron spheres through levers and tensioned arms, embodied this patient cruelty. It occupied no central stage. It lay beneath floors, behind palisades, along narrow passes, where the weight of gravity and the pull of coiled rope could strike without warning. When triggered by pressure, by tripwire, by any subtle movement of the enemy, the cores shot forward with a sudden, crushing authority, striking shields, limbs, and morale alike. The machine itself was invisible in its intent, its frame modest, almost innocuous, yet it transformed the space it occupied into a theater of inevitability. Patrols moved differently through forests, courtyards, and abandoned lanes, every footfall measured against the unknown angle of the trap. Engineers refined angles and weights as carefully as they would a siege engine's arm, for a sphere released too soon or too late could be useless, and yet timing was more art than science. The core trap, like all the engines before it, required no celebration of size, no grand display, only the assurance that, when it acted decisively. Its presence taught that control could reside in patience, that a hidden weight could alter decisions, slow advances, and fragment formations in a way that human arms alone could not. And from the understanding of hidden inevitability, the next device appeared, a convergence of miniature mechanics and portability, allowing a single soldier to wield the logic of these larger engines in the palm of his hand. From the silent menace of the core trap, the evolution of these engines narrowed to something that could be carried entirely by one man, a final distillation of reach and leverage into a frame no larger than a stout chest. The handheld throwing mechanism, a proto-miniature ballistae, captured all the lessons of its larger kin: torsion, arm leverage, the inevitability of physics, in a device built to fit in infantry lines without ceremony. Its arm flexed under the pressure of twisted fibers, releasing bolts and small darts with a snap that resonated farther than the projectile itself, bending the space around it into caution. It didn't dominate battles, nor did it need to. In alleys, courtyards, and narrow corridors, its presence forced movement into careful rhythms, its operator dictating zones of threat with the mere act of aiming and releasing. Every shot carried the weight of intention rather than mass, teaching that the precision of placement could match, and sometimes surpass, the brute power of larger engines. In ambushes, it was a whisper that became a strike. In open skirmishes, It fractured formations with the certainty of gravity obeying its own rules. Through this small frame, centuries of siege logic, the tension of rope, the swing of arms, the arc of fear, condensed into something mobile, immediate, and mercilessly predictable. And so the lineage of forgotten projectile engines reached its quiet apex, where human hand and mechanical principle merged to extend danger across spaces that once seemed safe. And from that final, handheld engine, the chain of invention slackened into quiet, leaving the battlefield measured not by walls broken or lives lost, but by the subtle reshaping of space, time, and expectation. Each machine, the short ballista, the hand catapult, the stone thrower, the dart system, the bomb sling, the short trebuchet, the javelin thrower, the fire sling, the core trap, and the handheld throwing mechanism, had spoken in its own language, carving arcs of inevitability, bending movement and hesitation alike. The air itself seemed heavier in their presence, charged with the memory of trajectories traced, of tension released, of distance transformed into a statement that could neither be ignored nor negotiated. And as silence returned between volleys and arcs, what remained was not the wreckage, nor the smoke, nor the splintered wood, but the weight of expectation carried forward by invisible motion, by machines that moved in time before soldiers even counted their steps. They left behind a landscape reshaped, a rhythm imposed, a quiet authority that endured long after the bolts, darts, stones, and fire had fallen. And so the story of these forgotten engines concluded, not in spectacle, but in the still, dense presence of what they had taught the ground, the air, and all who moved within it. That distance, motion, and inevitability were always companions to those who understood them.